Hey, it's Ryan. This is Sean. We're recording an episode of This American Hustle. The video is what the video is. We're just gonna do the podcast and kind of share a bit of our dialogue. And the topic today is basically, why am I not getting paid enough? And what I mean by that is unemployment is like incredibly low. There are supposedly fewer people looking for jobs than before 9/11 happened. So like 16, 17 years ago. So that should be fantastic news. But it's weird because wages haven't gone up. People haven't made more money. They're not getting, their salaries don't go up, hourly rate, whatever it is. So this is a really interesting topic because it's confusing and it doesn't really make sense why that's the case. And I think everybody, at least according to a lot of media, everybody pretty much agrees that wage growth and like salary growth and income growth is not impressive. There's a divide between certain groups of people, certain classes of people. So we wanted to break that down a little bit. Sean did some research, and I'm going to try and keep him honest, make sure I can understand exactly what he's talking about, and that's it. So let's get into it.
All right. So first off, the kind of thing to address when you're talking about wage stagnation, and that technical term is...
Whoa. What's stagnation?
So like, when you're talking about the idea that there's been such limited wage growth, and in a time when it seems like there's this kind of recovery after the recession, that people are kind of assuming that there's an outlook that kind of is positive. And
let's be clear, like if you're like 21, you're like, what recession?
Yeah, like exactly. You really, like, you didn't feel it. Your parents did, but if they did a good job, they probably hid it from you. Like, so it's that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, 2008, right? 2008 was the crash. Official unemployment was really high. It was like 11%, which is really high for the United States. But unofficially, a lot of people were sort of on the sidelines. Like, a lot of people stopped looking for work. It was a really rough time, and the recovery has been not great. Okay.
I mean, it's a long road too, and that's the thing that a lot of people are trying to think, that there's no quick fix to something like an economic problem.
Right.
And I think I read something earlier this week where it was it uses like the Steve Jobs, like the simplicity in design doesn't apply to economic policy.
Oh yeah, right. Because everybody wants it to be like real, coherent and clean, and that's just not where you're going to get.
And you can't do that because there's too many facets that you have to approach. And the one that we're going to talk about pretty much specifically in this episode is labor. And labor is one of those things that it's heavily studied and it's important to the U.S. economy, but it's also kind of taken a back seat in a lot of different ways.
Okay.
And so I'll talk about this in a kind of a multifaceted fashion. So what I'll start with is what a pretty much prominent economist named Lawrence Mitchell made a point that there was pretty much 5 aspects that kind of like allowed for wage stagnation to occur over the past couple of years, and past decades rather.
Okay.
And the first one is that we kind of abandoned the idea of full employment.
Okay.
And
I'm gonna write that down because I don't know what that means really.
Yeah. So full employment, we'll put it in. We'll try and write it out as quickly as possible and make it as easy as possible for people to understand. So full employment essentially means that you kind of ignore the idea of employment versus inflation, which is something that the Federal Reserve is pretty much always trying to approach a natural balance of about 4% unemployment, or about 5% unemployment, and about 2% inflation rate. And when you're talking about full employment, it means 100%. So it means that there's zero unemployment. That's the natural goal, besides natural unemployment, which means like people who are actively searching for work or in between jobs kind of thing.
There's a lot of numbers, and I'm familiar with them, but I want to make it real clear. So unemployment that's a controversial term, right?
It is, because there's so many different ways that people look at it.
Right. There's like, most people would say, the official definition, I think what is confusing to a lot of people is the official definition is you have to be registered with whoever it is, like your state labor department or whatever, to be collecting unemployment.
Yes.
And unless you're collecting unemployment, you're not in that number, right?
Exactly.
So potentially, and like the problem with it, the reason people have like an issue with it is because there's a lot of people give up, right?
Exactly.
Or they're not eligible for unemployment, right?
Yeah. So because if depending on how long they've been out of work.
Okay.
If they've been out of work for a certain amount of time, they can't collect it.
Yeah.
Also, on top of the fact that there's many different like kind of aspects. If you were registered as self-employed or anything like that, there's different ways that they can not allow you to collect unemployment.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because I think
that's
like
one
a
of the
whole
portions of this too.
Yeah, it's a whole side topic, but a lot of people these days are doing like gig economy stuff or more creative stuff out of necessity or a choice. So they might be listed as self-employed. Okay,
exactly.
That's interesting. Okay, so I don't want to dig into that.
And but also at the same time, I'll kind of get back to that about the idea of misclassification of people who put themselves down as self-employed, but they're really unemployed.
Okay.
In reality.
Okay.
So that's another facet that I'll probably try to get to in some breath. But I think the one thing that I really want to get at is kind of this idea of there's not a driving force that's kind of helping labor the same way that it was when the baby booming and post World War II, and that really kind of helped people get to a position where economic mobility was at its all-time highest, essentially, in the United States.
All right. So I kind of know what labor is, but it's I think it's kind of an abstract term because it depends on how you're using it and what else you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? So what do you mean by that?
Well, labor technically, when you're talking about it in the broadest of terms, means it's essentially the same thing as employment. Okay. So you can talk about labor.
All the Americans who are working.
All the people who are working.
Okay.
Because you could be in manufacturing, you could be a white collar guy, you could be doing blue collar stuff. Okay. But technically, everybody is. If you have a job, you are registered in the Department of Labor.
Okay.
And that's what it'll get down to.
Okay.
But the one thing that I found really interesting about the stuff that I was reading, especially from Lawrence Mitchell, was the one thing that he talked about was declining union density and people not being involved in unions as much.
Right. This is very controversial.
Extremely controversial.
Right.
Like very contentious topic.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think the one thing that I want to get at is that there's part of the reason why it's become so controversial is because of the way that people have treated unions and the way that they've been looked at.
Okay.
So it's kind of hard to not go on public media nowadays and not see some kind of negative spin on unions.
Okay. Yeah.
Because there's some people that see it as a positive light and there's some people that see it in a negative light. And mostly the way that they see it is that the unions are trying to take advantage of companies and get the most out of the companies and for the least amount of work for the workers.
Right.
Which I think is partially true, but also not true in very many ways. I think they're trying to get the fairest treatment that they could get with their maximum utility, with their ability to put out whatever they can do.
What does that mean?
So whatever the workers who work for a company, when they're performing at their highest efficiency, when they're doing the best they can at their jobs, they should be getting compensated at their highest.
Full hustle.
Full hustle. Like they're doing their job the way they're supposed to do it. They should be compensated justly. Okay. And because of things like unions, it allows them to kind of get what they deserve in that way. And the way that normally is done is something called collective bargaining. And collective bargaining is essentially where a union comes together and they work together to set specific salaries, specific wages, so that it's fair treatment for all employees, that they get compensated for their hours worked, for their overtime, for everything.
Right.
And that's becoming less and less popular because of the decrease in unions.
Okay.
And one of the points that I wanted to make is kind of as a response to what I was reading is what would stop a company from taking up collective bargaining without necessarily using unions? Because if union is such a kind of like plagued term, people don't look at it in a good light anymore as compared in the 40s and 50s where it was like everybody was part of a union. Mm-hmm. Like 40%, almost 40% of people in the United States were involved in some form of union.
Okay.
And now there's less than what is it? About 11% participation. So
okay. Right.
So can there be a way for companies to kind of approach this fairness, this equity kind of thing, the same way that unions would without actually using the term union?
Okay. So that's you kind of suggesting like a whole new innovation. Like I'm sure
that there's definitely companies I know for a fact there are companies that do it at a very efficient way that use collective bargaining without necessarily full on using unions the same way that they were used in the 40s and 50s and 60s.
Okay. Okay. So
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's a lot. So you're saying people are not getting wage growth hasn't happened because of the decline of unions?
I wouldn't say that it's not the only reason. There's lots of other things that play into it, and one of the things was the idea of, and then I'll get into the policy side of things. This is the really the part that's really hard for people to digest because it's a lot to take in, and so.
Careful.
Yeah, this is where I'm going to tread lightly because this is when you start getting into things like fiscal and monetary policy and stuff like that. Yeah. And it's the tough part is that probably within the past couple of decades, our government has made pretty poor decisions in terms of labor market policies and business practices that kind of would normally protect people that are working in lower level, lower skilled labor jobs.
Okay.
So things that people would not be, the compensation has not been rising the way that you would expect it, and that's something that we opened with.
Right.
And
I'm gonna put, this is just me being sensitive. I don't like that phrase "low skilled" because I feel like a lot of positions are still very important to like a functioning society, and I think that there's like even though it's not intentional, I think there's like a little negativity in that phrasing.
There is,
but I know that's the technical.
I'm trying to avoid. That's another thing. I don't want it to sound too like there's this huge discrepancy between the people who are high skilled, have been gone through serious education in order to get where they are, and that's not necessarily claiming that one is more necessary than the other. Yeah. And that's the one thing that's another important part that I want to talk about is that we kind of have gotten to this point where we have compensations for CEOs and executives at major companies getting paid so vastly that the discrepancy is so huge between the people who are working as like a janitor or someone else who's doing the other labor forces in a company.
Right. Between
their executives.
The way, and this is maybe where you're getting at. The way I've heard it phrased is like, take the average of everybody in the company, and then how many more times does the CEO make?
Yeah.
And I've heard different numbers. So I think historically it was like 10 or 15x or something. You know, so like 15 employees' salaries per one CEO's salary, and now it's where are we at now?
We're at the point where. So this is where it's hard for me to not get into the way that I'm to address this the way that I'm going to. So so essentially the way it works nowadays is because of certain policies, companies are only able to deduct tax reductions from the first million of CEOs or executives' salaries.
Okay.
But a caveat to that is that they can receive bonuses and additional salaries based on the idea that they performed well. So a high performance base.
Right, yeah.
And they can deduct exactly
options.
And stock options and all those different things.
Right.
So they've essentially been able to maneuver around the whole idea of paying these people in base salary by using things like bonuses and stock options to increase their amount of money that they're making.
Okay.
And the one problem that I have with that is that if we approach our tax rates, especially things like corporate tax and stuff like that, in a better way, then those massive bonuses wouldn't even be necessary because those executives could be paid higher salaries in a way that they wouldn't have to be taking on these massive bonuses. And at the same time, there would still probably be a decent amount of money left over to redistribute to the rest of the company.
Okay. So let me see it. So that I think that's like the top down, right?
Yeah.
Or like if you look at a company and you're like.
And also, this is not trickle down economics because to quote one of my girlfriend's father, actually, the way he describes it is voodoo economics, which is essentially meaning that trickle down economics is not nearly as applicable as people think it is, and it doesn't. And it just doesn't work. I mean,
but the trick, there's a lot of things here. So, I mean, but trickle down really applies to people who own businesses, right?
Yes.
So this is, when we're talking about CEOs, CEOs are basically, it doesn't seem like it from the bottom of a company, but like they're basically employees.
They are.
Right?
Yeah.
They're employees of the board, they're employees of the shareholders or whatever. So they kind of fall into a different bucket.
They do.
Which is, and I think that's an important distinction because, like, you know, if you're going to be Richard Branson and Elon Musk, you know, and you're going to build something from, you know, barren earth and create like a magnificent company that helps millions of people, that's like a very different thing than if you just had a series of stable, secure jobs for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, and then you got promoted to be a CEO, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a very different. Elon Musk takes way more risk than the CEO of, I don't know,
like Goldman or any of those guys.
Yeah. So I think that's really important. But how does that relate to what I'm making though?
Okay, so this is where it all comes back, is that if we adopt policies that essentially allow things like inflation-adjusted wages, which has not occurred since like the 90s.
Okay.
Our essentially the minimum wage has stayed the same, and this is not necessarily me saying that we have to raise the minimum wage. It just needs to be adjusted appropriately, and that's the term that's one of the really like hot topic for economists specifically, is that the idea of raising the minimum wage is over optimizing and overstating. I hate using the term again, but low skill labor, and giving them not too much credit, but because it just doesn't equilibrate really well, and it doesn't allow people.
Whoa. What do you mean? I just realized something else unrelated to what you're about to say. The reason I don't like the word low skill labor is because I know so many talented people with degrees, bachelor's degrees, or which completed some type of like skilled education, who are working in the jobs people would identify as low skilled. And I think that's like one of the, I don't know if it's people say it's a new thing since the recession, I don't know, a millennial thing, but there's a lot of people who, the morality like of it I think is subtle. It's like, but it's important like to acknowledge that like people have really tried to make it, right? This whole thing's like this American hustle is about how to make it, right? So people have tried to make it. Anyway, I'm just sad.
But I also completely agree with that too. And there needs to be a way to talk about something as difficult as low skilled labor without saying it with a negative undertone.
Yeah. Anyway.
So what I'll try to get at the core of this all is that there needs to be a way so that when it comes down to it, people who are working, regardless of position, regardless of where they are in a company, where they are in an organization, where they are, and if they're working in an administrative job for the government, are getting paid appropriately for their position based on what they do and based on their performance.
Okay.
Because that's one of the things that is really hard to create one universal policy for, and there shouldn't be a universal policy, and that's one of the things that I want to get at too.
Okay. Got it. Sort of.
So,
I think if I talk to my, I'm not working right now, but like in theory, if I was talking to a boss or something, right? Or imagine someone employee talking to the boss, they go, "Well, we're paying you the market rate."
Yeah.
Right. That's the phrase, right? Like, we could get somebody else to do your job for the same money or whatever. So, what does that mean?
So one thing that.
Or what's your take on that?
My take on that is that there needs to be a way for people to strategize how they go into those conversations with their bosses.
Okay.
Because there's so many people that say you're not earning enough and this is how you earn more. You know what I mean? And I won't sit here saying that I know the magic formula to how you can get paid like 5 times more than you get paid right now, because I don't, and I don't think anyone really does. So, and people claiming that they do is kind of extravagant. But what I'm going to try and get at is that there's a way for people to go in there and critically analyze the work that they're doing and say, listen, if I do this, this, and this, have performance goals, and they go in there and meet them, and they go into their boss and talk about their salary, there should be a way for them to get compensated justly. And if that comes through bonuses, that comes through promotions, whatever it is, there has to be a way for, regardless of what your position is, to be able to go in there and have that conversation confidently and make more money that way.
Okay. And do you have that advice now?
I don't have that advice because if I did, maybe I'd be a career counselor. But that's not what I'm doing. So
check out the Apprentice Code. We have a blog on that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I wrote one on my personal blog, and I'm gonna be bringing it over. But yeah. There's a whole process. I mean, I think just practical advice is you have to understand what your company values, and then really your particular manager and like basically who she or he reports to know what's urgent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's really, people are going to pay for like the important thing that's happening now or in 6 months, or there has to be something they can see, and you have to have a conversation with them and talk to them about what's important.
Exactly.
And if they can't tell you what's important, that's maybe a signal that you're working for the wrong manager. But I think, it's hard. Like I think I switched careers in 2012, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And it was partially because it was internal, right? Like I fit for the thing I was doing, but partially because I was like, I don't really see, it seemed like the people who were like 50 years old in the company had a much easier time of getting to where they were than it looked like I was going to have. I was like 27, 28 at the time. So it was a bummer. It was a bummer, and it made me like pessimistic, and we had gone through layoffs, like a lot of layoffs, and so it was really clear, like even if I had a really good like conversation with my manager, and I knew a lot of people who did this, like it wasn't just me, they'd have a conversation with their manager, agree on like, oh, if I hit these goals, by whatever 6 months from now, then I can get a promotion, and it just like never happened. It was like a proverbial like carrot hanging out, and I think if you find yourself in one of those situations, you have to think about switching careers, maybe. And I think that's one of the things like I'm very I'm like personally an advocate for. And it's part of the work that we're trying to do, like through this podcast and the company, is like basically help people understand how to make that transition. But the question is, where do you go? And how do you not fall into like the same old patterns or whatever?
And so this is another topic that I also wanted to kind of address. So because of things like the international labor market, because of things like cheap labor, globalization. I have it in
China,
in big texts, text.
The CH in China is not big enough.
Yes, no.
China.
So stuff like that. I mean, it's naturally going to be harder as time progresses.
I should hate Mexico?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
And this is where it's really tough, because you're telling people that maybe they should pursue something else, and maybe sometimes they don't want to, and that's kind of what you're kind of saying, is that a lot of people sometimes feel a security in whatever they're at right now, whatever job they're in, whatever position, and the prospects of leaving that security are scary. And even if the prospects of their future in that specific position are very bleak, they will still stay there because that's the only thing they know. And I think there needs to be a really large shift in the idea of reeducation and getting people back to something that they wouldn't have normally pursued, but because of some kind of labor force reeducation program that could easily go into policy if people really, really pushed it. Because I think a lot of people could get behind the idea that they could have higher mobility, not career mobility, not necessarily economic mobility, but be able to move between career to career in a much more seamless fashion. And because right now it's almost like if you want to go and switch careers, then you have to go to like some online university, like University of Phoenix or something, get an MBA and like redo everything and find a new path. When it could easily be done internally through companies. It could be easily done internally through government organizations, and it's just because there's a pushback against it, and I think if we're gonna really fight the international labor market is that we have to evolve rather than try to protect. And I think that's the one, and that's the one thing.
This is the key.
This is the key that I want to.
Political, topical.
Yes, very topical.
Topical.
And
topical thing.
Yeah, and I wrote about it a couple times in different respects in a couple of my different blogs about the idea of industries that are kind of dying out. They're not dying out in the sense that they're not going to be around anymore, but dying out in the sense that they're not going to have the same labor force numbers that they had many decades ago. Because we're still going to have manufacturing jobs in the United States. It's just they're going to be people who operate the machines that are automated that do the manufacturing.
Right.
And what can easily happen to make that easier is if people pursue jobs and pursue education that allow them to learn those skills so that they don't have to worry about working or competing with someone across the world, across the ocean, that will do their job for half of what they actually get paid. And that's the one thing that the United States has to realize, is that our comparative advantage is in our people. We have unbelievable human capital.
Well, what's comparative advantage? Why we tend to succeed more? Like, I think it's also important to point out like how amazing it is to be an American in some ways. Like, not to be like all MAGA and stuff, but like the amount of economic productivity we have is like vastly more than most countries.
Yeah. And in terms of growth figures and everything like that, our GDP is massive. Our growth national income is massive. All of that, all of the different things that come into it, that when people look at the big numbers for the United States, we have an impressive economy, and that's something.
And that's what's hard about it, I think, is because when you see a job leave, you're like, well, I want the job back. Yeah. But the thing is, we have to sort of like, I don't know a good like visual analogy, but we have to be skimming over the top of everybody else in the world, right? Like we have to be doing whatever the highest productivity thing is in order to maintain an American experience. Exactly. Right? And I think that's really tough. I think that's one of the things that I think is crappy about how it's talked about, particularly by politicians. Is it's just very practical. Like we need to be operating at a high level, and just getting back to the old jobs is not a high level. No. So we have to talk about that. Anyway, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think I'll go back to comparative advantage, basic economic principles. The idea of like, the United States might be able to produce the same kind of labor that someplace like China can. But China can produce at such a higher volume than the United States. But the United States can also produce higher levels of education with people with high skills that can do things that people in another country wouldn't be able to do. So it's to the best comparative advantage for them to allow the countries that still have that high labor force numbers to take on those low-skilled jobs, whereas the United States should be investing in what is human capital, what people are capable of doing with more education, with more skills training, and more approach in the idea that they're able to have this skimming over the top, what Ryan says, the ability to have the foresight to see what the future careers are that will allow the growth of other industries and other different facets of the economy to happen. The forward thinking that allows the job market to evolve the way that it needs to.
Okay, this is a huge topic. I'm gonna try and wrap it up. So this is way too big. This is bigger than I thought. But basically, some things we boiled it down to is like, if you're in a job, try and control the situation by understanding what's important to your company and building your skills and your performance towards that. But the other thing is be open to changing careers if it's not going to happen within that job.
Absolutely.
And then you got to go to higher ground. So identifying higher ground doesn't look like asking what China or India is doing. It looks like
it's creating our own ground essentially.
It's got to be innovation or something that's innovative. I'm not going to say technology, but something that's innovative, right?
It's that the United States can't really afford to be allowing the system to kind of dictate status quo.
We can't be average.
We have to be pathfinders too. We have to move down a way that no one else has gone before in order for other people all around our country to succeed. And I think it's not just a small America is not just a low skill, it's a middle class problem as much as it is a lower class problem in the United States.
Right on. Thanks, Sean.
All right.
All right.
It was a good day.
See you later, guys.